Hello. All right. This is Chris Good, and we're back with part 2 of our practice interpreting main effects and interactions video, and this is working off this worksheet that we've posted for you guys. These are 8 graphs, and we're supposed to state whether there appears to be a significant main effect of each factor and whether the interaction appears to be significant, and describe the nature or direction of the main effect and interaction. And so far we've been through these top 4 graphs right here, looking at separate main effects of whether people expected to get alcohol or not. That's one factor with 2 levels. And whether people actually got alcohol or not. That's the second factor with 2 levels. And we're looking at effects on what? What are we measuring? We're measuring the mean intensity of a shock people will give to punish someone for cheating. Now, nobody's actually shocked here. We just asked them to turn this dial just to imagine how much you would shock someone. And that's our measurement of how aggressive they're behaving, because we think alcohol might be related to aggression, but there are non-specific effects of alcohol as well that have to do with our expectations about it. And so we're measuring the effects of these 2 things separately. So we've been through these 4 graphs already. Let's try these. So once again, we're looking for first a main effect of expecting alcohol. All right? Now, for the people who expected alcohol, some people got it, and that's this point here, and some people didn't, and that's this point down here. Nobody got like a medium dose of alcohol, which might be somewhere in the middle, but it's the middle of the line where we need to look to find out where the entire group who expected alcohol are performing on average. The middle point of the line happens to be where the average between this group, people who expected alcohol and got it, and this group, people who expected alcohol and didn't get it. So if you average those 2 things together, you find that their performance, the shock that they give, is right in the middle of the line, right about here on the y-axis. Okay? People who didn't expect alcohol. Some people actually got it, and some people didn't. But on average, people who did not expect alcohol are performing right here. So if we want to look at a main effect of expectation, we compare the midpoint of the expect line with the midpoint of the do not expect line. And the nature of the effect is clear. People who expected to get alcohol gave a more intense shock than people who did not expect alcohol, and that's regardless of whether they actually got it or not. It's just the main effect of expectation. Okay, now let's do the other main effect. Did they get alcohol or didn't they? For people who got alcohol, there were people who were expecting it and people who didn't. And that the midpoint, the point in between these 2 end points, line end points, this is where people were performing on average when they received alcohol, regardless of whether they expected it or not. So averaging across those 2 groups, people who got alcohol, people who didn't get alcohol. Right? So for no alcohol, we got to average between these 2 endpoints here. People who got alcohol, people who didn't get alcohol. So it's obvious that people who got alcohol gave a more intense shock than people who didn't get alcohol. And that's the nature of the main effect of alcohol, regardless of whether they expect it or not. So we got 2 main effects here. The main effect of expectation, right? And the main effect of alcohol. It's quite obvious from the graph that these 2 lines are going to intersect somewhere over here, which means we have an interaction. So how do we describe the nature of the interaction? Well, you have an interaction when the effects of one factor are different at different levels of another factor. And the nature of the interaction is how those effects are different. So let's start with the effect of expectancy. We already know that there's a main effect of expectancy. People who expect alcohol give a more intense shock than people who don't expect alcohol. Let's look at that effect just on this side. Right? People who expected alcohol at the endpoint here gave a much more intense shock than people who didn't expect alcohol. And that's when they got it. Do you see the same magnitude of the effect here in the group that didn't get alcohol? People who expect alcohol did give a more intense shock than people who did not expect alcohol. But this difference isn't the same as this difference. And that difference is the effect of expecting alcohol, right? So here's when you don't expect it, and when you do, it goes up this much when you actually get it. Here's where you don't expect it, and it when you don't get alcohol, expecting to get it increases the shock only this much. So the effects of expectation are much greater when you actually receive alcohol than when you don't. And that is an interaction. That's also the nature of the interaction. We have an interaction when the effects of one factor, expectation, are different at different levels of the other factor, which is whether you actually got it or not. Let's look at this one more time. What's the nature of the interaction? Well, here, the effects of expectation are larger when you get alcohol than when you don't. In fact, you might be convinced that this difference is insignificant, in which case you could say that you only see significant effects of expectation when you actually receive alcohol, and there is no effect of expectation when you don't. I'd also accept that. This will become clear as we go through a couple more examples. Let's check it out, shall we? Here's one that's a little tricky. We clearly have an interaction because the lines cross right in the middle of the paper. But let's go back to the beginning and take it one step at a time. To look at the effects of expectancy, remember we got to do the midpoints of the line. So here's people who expected alcohol and they got it, and here's where they didn't get it, and on average their performance is right at the midpoint of the line right there. Here's the average of the people who did not expect alcohol but got it, and here's people who did not expect alcohol and didn't get it. And their performance on average is in the same spot. It's in the middle of that line, right where the two lines cross. So there's no real difference between these 2 points. So there's no main effect of expectation. Let's go to the main effect of alcohol, right? You got it or you didn't get it. If you got alcohol, your performance is somewhere in between the the end points of these two lines, expect and do not expect. So on average, right there, right in the middle. Let's go over to the y-axis, right there. If you didn't get alcohol, your performance is somewhere between the endpoints of these lines, when people expected alcohol and didn't expect it. Right there, right in the middle. It's the same. So no main effect of alcohol overall. No main effect of expectation, no main effect of alcohol when you average across the other factors. There's clearly an interaction, but what could the nature of it possibly be? Well, let's look at the no alcohol group and talk about what the effects of expectation are. There's no overall main effect of expectation, but clearly when you don't get alcohol, expecting it increases the intensity of the shock compared to not expecting it. So there's an effect of expectation when you don't get alcohol. Does it do the same thing when you don't get alcohol? Well, when you don't expect alcohol, you get a more intense shock than when you do expect alcohol if you're actually getting it, right? So here, the effects of expectation go one way when you get alcohol, but they go in the opposite direction when you actually do get it. Let's say that one more time, make sure we got it right. When you don't get alcohol, the effects of expectation go in this direction. When you do get alcohol, they go in the opposite direction. So here, the effects of expectation are, when you get alcohol, are opposite those when you don't get it. So that's a third way that you can have an interaction, the third nature of the interaction. Here, we talked about two of them. The effects of expectation are greater when you get alcohol than when you don't. Or if this difference is insignificant over here, the effects of expectation are present only when you get alcohol and they're absent when you don't. Here, the effects of expectation when you don't get alcohol are opposite those when you do. And that's the nature of this type of interaction. No interaction down here in the lower left, clearly, because the lines don't cross, but the design of the experiment's different. Here, we have no alcohol, and this is a blood alcohol concentration, so 0.05 and 0.10, right? And that's 0.10% by volume of alcohol, and I think it's 10 mils of blood. We have 3 levels of one factor, how much alcohol you actually get, and 2 levels of the expectation factor, just like we always had. So now we have a 3 by 2 design. Let's take a look at the main effect. For expect, here the the average happens to be in the middle of the line, right? You'd have to actually calculate the average if it weren't straight exactly like this. And we'll come back to that in the next graph. The average of the do not expect group right in the middle of this straight line. So clearly a main effect of expectation, if you expect alcohol, you give a greater shock than when you don't expect alcohol. And that's regardless of what your blood alcohol concentration was. If you average across the expectation groups, here's where people receiving no alcohol shocked, right? A little bit greater shock when your BAC is 0.05, and an even greater shock when the BAC is 0.10. And here, because we have more than 2 points, it allows you to make a dose-dependent conclusion, which is the more alcohol you have, the greater the shock that you'll get. You can't say that here, right? Even though there is a main effect of alcohol, this is you either have it or you don't. Here we have varying concentrations. So with no alcohol, low shock, medium alcohol, medium shock, high dose of alcohol, a higher shock. So the more alcohol you have in your bloodstream, the greater the shock that you'll give. No interaction though, because these lines don't intersect. Finally, let's look over here. Clearly there's an interaction here. These lines are going to intersect off the graph over here. If we look at the main effect of expectation, here's where you're performing if you expect alcohol, kind of in the middle of this line. Here's where you are performing if you don't have alcohol, right in the middle of this line. Clearly the effect of expectation is if you expect alcohol, you give a greater shock than if you don't. Same pattern that we saw in the previous graph in terms of increasing concentration. The more alcohol you have, the greater the shock that you'll give, right? Can't really say that over here because you either have it or you don't. When you have alcohol, you give a greater shock than when you don't. Here it's dose dependent. The more alcohol you have, the greater the shock that you give. There's clearly an interaction, but what's the nature of the interaction? You have an interaction when the effects of one factor, here expectancy, are different at different levels of the other factor. And we clearly have an interaction here. The effects of expectancy are different when you don't have alcohol than when you have a little bit than when you have a lot. Well, how are the effects of expectation different when you don't get alcohol than when you have a little bit than when you have a lot? Well, the difference between the expect and do not expect line here is small, here it's a little bit larger, and here it's the largest. And the difference between these 2 points, these 2 points, and these 2 points represents that effect of expectation. Clearly, overall, expecting alcohol increases the intensity of the shock that you'll give. But that effect is stronger as you increase the blood alcohol concentration. The distance between these two lines grows greater as you move from no alcohol to a BAC of 0.05 to a BAC of 0.10. So we can say that the nature of the interaction is as follows. The effects of expectation are greater with increasing blood alcohol concentration. So the effects of expectation are larger as you move from no alcohol to 0.05 to 0.10. Here's another way of saying it. The effects of expectation, right? Well, let me say it this way. The greater your blood alcohol concentration, or the more alcohol you have, the greater the effects of expecting alcohol. That's a good way of talking about this interaction. We'll get more practice using some different data in a separate video, and I will see you then.